That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The British Constitution provides that taxation and representation shall go together. Therefore, women taxpayers are entitled to vote.
I have a dream today. Let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true.
Welcome to episode 6 of the Only Human podcast, where we continuously try to close the gap between who we are and who we're capable of becoming. Before we get started on today's topic, I want to say thanks to those of you who are sharing what we're doing together, especially those of you who are sending questions and comments, because one of these comments prompted a reset of my entire planned podcast flow and led to the series we're starting today on how we learn things. We call learning stuff. So here's what it said. It said, Tony, great podcast. I'm really enjoying it. Probably could have cut that part out, but at some point down the road, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the differences between education and training and what you think is going on in education today. Wow. Did that ever open up a bucket of snakes for me? So much so that I've outlined the next 4 podcasts to try to answer that specific question, because there's a lot more that meets the eye there. More critically, what does all this mean to you? So let's get started with Blue Threat Proverb number 26, our Blue Threat Proverb of the week. It says, you cannot uneducate someone who has learned to read. This is a quote from the great human rights leader Cesar Chavez, who fought for the rights of farm workers in the 1960s and 1970s. And we're going to come back to his main point here in a minute. But I want to give you his full quote, because sometimes we take things out of context. You need to know that Cesar Chavez grew up in a farming town, Yuma, Arizona. Maybe not be a farming town anymore, but there's still a lot of farming that goes on there. He was a son of farm workers, right? And as he grew up, he began to lament the plight of generational poverty and the lack of upward mobility for his people. So his life purpose, something we talked about last week, if you missed the Incredible Power of Personal Purpose, episode 5, please go back and look at it. But his life purpose was to change the conditions for those people. So here's his full quotation. Once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who's learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are no longer afraid. We've seen the future, and the future is ours. Now, that was obviously from a speech that he gave as he was organizing the farm workers, but back to this concept of not being able to uneducate somebody who's learning to read. Let's start there, because most of our education begins there. Do you remember when you were taught to read? It began, at least for me, probably like it did for you, with learning to recognize letters. I actually remember my mom holding up the different letters and having me say them back to her as she said them to me. It was rote memorization. Right? Then we learned to, sound out the letters, right? The vowels and the consonants, A, E, I, O, U, memorized flashcards with words. Then we learned the meaning of those words. And then once we had the letters and the words down, we could sound things out. We had to learn about sentence structure and grammar. And somewhere in that process, something magical happened. Right? All of those letters, all of those sounds, all of the grammar and punctuation began to make sense to us. The words took on meaning, and it was no longer about learning to read, it was learning from reading, right? When that happened, the entire world opened up to us, right? And eventually allowed us access to everything that had been learned before, at least everything that had been written down. So Chavez was right. You can't uneducate somebody who has learned to read. Learning to read is one of those special skills that opens up everything else. They're not all like that, but there are a few. But also it's important to understand that learning to read was really vocational training for basic humanity, right? And it opened up nearly every door that we could possibly ever want to walk through. And walking through those doors from that vocational training set of how do I learn to read is where education began for all of us. So when Chavez set out to change the world for his people, he started simple with some basic training. And then he set out to change his people and his world and their children's world and grandchildren's world through education. You know what? He did it. Pretty powerful stuff. So I kind of feel uniquely qualified to talk about this topic, not because I'm a very smart person, because I'm not, but there's a few personal reasons I'll get to in a minute. But to cut to the chase, I realized at a very early age that education would open doors for me. Little did I know then how many doors it would open. So I've always been an avid learner. I think I got that from both my parents and my older brothers. And I've been able to leverage so-called formal education for all it is worth. Right? Let me just kind of walk you through that. Not that my story is important, but I think it'll play into the rest of the message that we have here today. So I started out in public education, a small school in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, in a little town called Marinesco, Michigan. We had first, second, third, and fourth grade all in the same room with one teacher. Her name was Mrs. Breitzman, and I can picture her face right now. I was in first grade at the time, and I was so proud when she'd give me the second and third grade arithmetic books to work on because I was doing really well, right? I was at the top of my class. There were only two of us in first grade at the time. But I went from there and I ended up down in lower Michigan at a much larger school, still public education, a little town called South Lyon, Michigan, back in the 60s and 70s. And education was still pretty solid back then. There were some very specific things you had to do to pass. We still had class rankings. We had valedictorians and salutatorians, of which I was neither. But I did okay. I did good enough to be able to get into college. And that's where a lot of my real education began. Up to then, a lot of it was education, but it was also training, right? Can you do math problems? Can you write a paragraph? So there was a merger of this how-to stuff with the so what stuff. But when you get into college, a lot of that changes. I'll come back to my college decisions here in a few minutes and beyond that. But that leads us to segment one, which is understanding and integrating education and training. So I told this story. I went on to college, and then actually I went on to many of them. I got my bachelor's degree from Albion College and a master's degree from Northern Michigan in political science and public administration, and then a second master's degree from Kansas State through the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, and that was in military history, military arts and science, and all that warfighting stuff. I got a doctorate from Texas Tech University, so pretty much all of my adult life up until about 20 years ago was in one way or another part of a formal training program, formal education program, but it was also a part of a formal training program because as extensive as my education was, my training was even far more extensive. So even before I went to college, I worked for a window company, Marvin Windows, and I learned how to put together windows, and I learned about insulation factors and double painting and triple painting and insulation distances and all of that stuff. And that was training for my job, which was building and selling wood windows at the time. I got kind of tired of that pretty quick. And 1980 rolls around, Ronald Reagan said, if you got two hands, a head, and a heartbeat, we can teach you to fly airplanes. And so I joined the Air Force, and that's where I began to receive what has accumulated to be about $3.5 million in training. And I like to say it's all been crammed into me a nickel at a time. But my story is just a little bit of an illustration. Undergraduate pilot training, squadron officers school, war colleges. After I left the military, senior executive service training and government executive training, on and on and on. It's all been very good, and some of it's been truly great. But what we need to know about whatever training we get, or whatever education we've had or are planning to have, is that integrated they're powerful, and separate they're still powerful, but not quite, right? There's a synergistic effect between what we know and what we learn to do. So to truly achieve our potential, we've got to combine these two. Education will provide you the perspective on the how and why to apply our training in the real world to make a buck or to make a difference. It's a world full of problems to solve, right? A world full of people to work with, challenges to overcome, differences to make. And Cesar Chavez knew this, and now we do. So let's take a deeper look at this with my basic 3 main point format. Point number 1 is our education never ends. Whether we like it or not, every experience teaches us something. If we don't recognize this, it could teach us the wrong lessons. Okay? Point number 2, where our formal education ends, our experiential education begins. Okay? In the real world, we're absent a teacher, right? We're absent a guide. There are no educational objectives or schoolhouse solutions to the problems. So we have to do all that on our own. And nobody ever really teaches us how to do that. But there's a few things that we can learn, and we'll talk about them today. And then point 3, training teaches us how to do something. Education teaches us why we might want to do that, how we might be able to learn to do it better beyond our training. For example, the value of compliance, something we've talked about before. The trained but uneducated might see the rule book as not really applying to them. They don't have the big picture. I'm just told how to do this by my boss. Who is she to tell me what to do? I know better because I'm closer to the work, blah, blah, blah. But the educated that's got a little bit deeper insight to why the rules exist in the first place, and the multiple risks of noncompliance, the distractions, the attitudes, the mindsets that can lead us astray, they'll have a bigger understanding of, and so therefore compliance won't be hard for them because they have the knowledge base to understand maybe not why a particular rule exists, but why rules exist in general. So that's segment 1, kind of an overview of where we're going. Segment 2 today, I want to start with a question. Are you intelligent or are you smart? And what's the difference? So to understand the difference, I kind of came up with a couple of basic axioms to talk about this. Intelligence is the capacity to acquire knowledge, put it in a bucket, and maybe apply it. While being smart is about making good decisions based on that knowledge that you have. Intelligence might be the depth of your understanding, while being smart is your agility of thinking in real-time situations, right? Intelligence gathers information about the terrain. Smartness navigates you through it. Okay? So which would you rather be, intelligent or smart? Hard to be smart without having a little bit of intelligence first, and you begin to see how these things bump up together and weave together, right? The fundamental undercurrent in all of these statements is that you can be educated and intelligent and not be smart, right? We all know educated idiots. Right? I might be one of them. But the point here is that without the ability to put your knowledge into play in the real world, education's nothing more than an academic exercise. Fill in a bucket with the stuff you can't use, and now you've got to store it somewhere. Kind of reminds me of my garage. I got buckets full of stuff I'm not using, stored everywhere. But someday I'll find a use for them, right? So here's the takeaway. You need the map. Education and intelligence provides us that. But without the experience, without the experiential learning of walking the terrain and tripping and stumbling a few times while you're out there and learning the right lessons from the trips and stumbles, you got little of true value. So let's move on to our second question. As we're gaining this intelligence and smartness, how do we do that? And my second question is, do you prefer a deep river or a wide one? Now I know it can be deep and wide, or it can be narrow and shallow, but what I'm trying to get at here, do you want to learn a lot about one thing or a little about many things? Only so much. I know there's a lot more RAM up here than I'm using, but there's only so much time to learn, and how we prioritize our learning is important because it determines where we focus. As I was contemplating moving from Southline High School, go Lions, and going to college, I had a lot of advice, most of it from my older brother, Mike, who I love dearly, a great role model. He's 10 years older than me, and so he had already graduated from the University of Michigan, go Blue, with a degree in aeronautical engineering that he immediately got a job with and put it to use, right? And Mike was adamant that I should pursue engineering as well, or at least something of value, and not some, air quotes, worthless liberal arts degree that wouldn't get me a job. You know, he had a good point. And it's one I think a lot of parents make to their kids. Do something you can go get a job with, right? Don't get a degree in basket weaving. But at that point, I didn't want a job. What I wanted was an education. And I wasn't really sure what job, if any, I wanted. And to make a career choice that early in life, at age 18 or 19 or 20 when you had to declare your, your major, didn't seem like a smart thing to do to me. So I ended up going to a small but excellent liberal arts college in Michigan, Albion College, go Brits. And I took a host of history, philosophy, and literature courses, all of which my brother Mike thought was worthless waste of tuition. At that time, it was Pell Grants and athletic scholarships, but a waste nonetheless. That served me well, and even later on in my higher education life, I had to choose between doing a PhD at the University of Texas, where I'd been invited to join a wonderful team with Dr. Bob Helmreich, the godfather of aviation human factors there at the University of Texas, and study underneath one of the masters. But if I did that, I would study what he was studying and just go much deeper. I'd take the deep river path and not the wide river but shallow path. But I ended up making the decision to go to Texas Tech and pursue an EDD, right? So PhDs drill down into a specific subject. You become one of the world's experts in something narrow. Or an EDD, a Doctor of Education, which is a broad brush on how we can educate people on any subject. The choice was similar for me as when I went to Albion. Go deep or go wide. And I chose wide again. Now, I'm not advocating either pathway for you or anybody else that you advise, but what I'm advocating is that you think for yourself and make a sound decision on what is best for you, what maps to your learning style, your personality, your goals, your objectives. So speaking of sound decisions, that kind of leads us into our final segment of the day. And it's, what is the outcome of all this education and experience? And I think I'd like to toss out the idea that it's wisdom. So segment 3, wisdom. Defined by me, is the quality of having the knowledge through education, the training, and the life experience to know what to do and when. I'll say that one again because I think it's pretty good. Wisdom is the quality of having the knowledge acquired through education, the training, and the experience to know what to do and when. I like to think of wisdom as the mature stage of all that has come before. And it combines our education, our training, our life experience, our wins and losses into something that is extraordinary, maybe even more than the sum of its parts. So, first of all, wisdom goes beyond knowledge. So knowledge is the accumulation of facts and information. Wisdom is the ability to discern and judge which aspects of that knowledge are true. Really important today because people are spitting all kinds of information at us that aren't, right? Misinformation, disinformation. What parts of that knowledge are right and meaningful to what we're dealing with? What parts of that knowledge are time-tested and lasting, and what parts of that knowledge only apply to the moment? And what parts of this knowledge of our educational background is applicable to our current challenges in life? Right? So wisdom goes beyond all that into something more. Right? It also goes beyond experience. Now, wisdom often stems from lived experience, but wisdom looks forward, right? It doesn't look back and say, man, a wiser decision would have been this, although we do a little bit of reflection to gain our wisdom. But wisdom is used in the real time and in the near future, right? It understands both our human and team and group and organizational and even world dynamics of everything that's going on, and able to help us make decisions and based on prediction, right? It's forward focused. It uses our past experience to project forward with some pretty good ideas about what we should do. Now, we can't make a decision until we're right in the moment, but we can certainly be preparing to make that decision, and that's part of what wisdom is. I think the third part of wisdom, at least true wisdom for me, is this idea of humility and a little bit of service attached to that. To me, a truly wise person will quickly recognize how much they don't know. Right? A lot of times when I get introduced to give some sort of public talk or something, they'll say, Tony Kern's a worldwide expert on this, that, or the other thing. And the first thing I do is cringe and then quickly get up on stage and say, thanks for the introduction, but I'm not an expert on anything. Because the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. And true experts are really rare in this world, right? They're usually very narrowly defined. And being a wide river guy, it's hard for me to be an expert on anything. So wisdom is key in making decisions that not only benefit ourselves through this humble approach to not knowing what we don't know, having respect for the unknown, and still applying that which we do know to make a real-time decision, but also in serving others, right? The door to true growth doesn't happen through narcissism. If it's all about you, you're going to seek narrow paths of short-term success or short-term gratification and pleasure seeking. If it becomes about others, you get a vast array of things to consider, and that will help you grow in wisdom, and it'll make your wisdom actually worth something to the world. And wisdom also goes past these short-term consequences, immediate gratification, into long-term thinking. So there's a lot more to talk about here today. We're going to talk a little bit more about wisdom in our next episode, where we're going to get into the topic of how we can transfer our wisdom through real-time mentorship. That's a word that's a buzzword out there today. I think a lot of people have been part of mentorship programs. I think personally the formal mentorship programs that are out there in the world are not very useful, but the informal ones that we grow through our own connections that happen organically, where we call people when we need some advice on something, and people call us, and we get into this mentor-protege relationship, are hugely beneficial. And there's a few things we can learn about that along the way. So that's where we're going on next episode. So please remember to tune in for that one. Okay, time for our takeaways, the final segment for today. Point number one, our education, our formal education never ends. We never stop learning. However, many people come to the conclusion that once they're earning a buck out there in the world, or once they're married and not in the workforce anymore, or once they've retired, that they're, quote, past the learning phase of their life, unquote. And a lot of people look back and say, yeah, man, I'm glad I don't have to take any tests anymore, blah, 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 blah. Hey, listen, every time that you Google up something you're not sure about, or you glance at Wikipedia, or you listen to a podcast, you're continuing your education, right? So your education never ends. We never stop learning. And when we recognize that, we can prioritize and focus what we're learning, from who and why, a little more carefully. So remember that. Your education never ends. Keep learning, and keep learning things that are important to you. Okay. Takeaway number two, education, training, and experience are all intrinsically linked together. Right? Even if we don't always see them that way, and we seldom really do, unless we take time in a moment like this, a reflection, to intentionally think about what we've formally learned, what we've gotten from our vocational training, and then what we've experienced in life and how they all fit together. Right? If you don't see the links, you can probably still get by with any one of these. You can be educated and be a teacher and maybe do some other things, right? You can be vocationally trained and make a good living. You can have life experience and just live off of that. But when you can find a way to tie all of those three together, you really have something special. And you have set the stage for that fourth thing, which is our takeaway number three, the mature stage of all of this, something we call wisdom, where we combine knowledge, training, and experience to know what to do with whom and when. So we've only begun to untangle the bucket of snakes we started out to untangle. We've got a long way to go on this learning stuff. So please stay tuned over the next few weeks to learn how we can make the most of it, to achieve our potential, and help others to do the same. Well, that's a wrap on episode 6 of Only Human, where we believe in the power of one. We believe in the power of you, where each of us can learn to make the most of the opportunities we've been given, and maybe even more importantly, the challenges we face. So thanks for listening, and please follow, link, share, promote, whatever else you can do to get the word out to what we're doing here together. I'm Tony Kern. Please keep the feedback coming, because after all, I'm only human. See you soon.